It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
We all will experience hard times. We'll all experience distress. And we know that a really important moderating factor that determines how we respond is the ability to describe our emotions. And so those men and boys who can describe their emotions, they're much less likely to respond with anger in the presence of distress.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
Today is the day I get to have a conversation with a really interesting person who knows stuff that I don't know. We get to do that with a guy by the name of Matt Tyler. Matt has a very extraordinary background working around the topic of boys and men. I'm really excited to talk with Matt. He works at the moment in Victoria with Jesuit Social Services on a project called the Man Box. We're going to dive into the Man Box and unpack it a little bit in the podcast today. Matt is going to be one of our guest speakers for the Bringing Up Boys Summit that's happening this Wednesday. If you haven't got your tickets, we have got such an incredible lineup of people. Peggy Orenstein, New York Times bestselling author of Boys and Sex. Professor Mark Brackett from Yale University. He's the director of the Center for Emotional Intelligence at Yale. Mia Friedman is going to be talking about how to raise the best boy in the room. Look, I could just keep on going. There's 12 extraordinary or 10 extraordinary guests, and Matt Tyler is one of them. For now, though, Matt Tyler, welcome to the Happy Families podcast.
Justin, thank you for having me. Thank you as well to the work you and Kylie do to make life and this country better for parents.
Oh, thank you. Matt, let's just talk briefly, maybe the 30-second version of the history of Matt Tyler. What qualifies you to talk about men and the Man Box and raising boys, helping us to help our boys be men of substance?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I guess I've spent the last decade or so working to apply my craft, trained as an economist, apply my craft in social services, oftentimes at the crisis end of things, Justin, and so child protection, in and around criminal justice, mental health. Unfortunately, overwhelmingly, those parts of our social service systems men and boys, are disproportionately represented. And so my work with the Men's Project at Jesuit Social Services seeks to move from that crisis end of things towards a greater focus on prevention and early intervention, and the Man Box is a really important part of that. So
let's talk about the Man Box. What is it?
Justin, put most simply, it's a set of beliefs that place pressure on men and boys to be a certain way, to be tough, to not show emotions, to be the breadwinner, always be in control. At the more extreme end, to use violence to solve their problems, to have as many sexual partners as possible.
Matt, when I hear you list those things, I can't help but think that, I'd imagine that there'd be two fairly common responses to what this concept of the Man Box is. The 2022 response, for those who are a little bit more progressive, would be, I can't believe we're still talking about this in 2022. Men aren't like that anymore. They don't need to be like that anymore. Why do we keep on playing into this stereotype? And I would imagine at the other end of the continuum, there would be a whole lot of people saying, but that's what it is to be a man. What's the problem? And then I guess there's probably a bunch of people in the middle who say, well, can we just let boys be boys? Can we just let boys grow into men and treat people with respect and kindness? What do you find is the response to these Man Box ideas? How many people really do endorse them, both male and female?
Justin, I want to reflect on something you just shared before coming to your question. This work builds on literally centuries of work by pro-feminist organisations, often led by women, to pursue gender equality. And I would say that we've made incredible strides so far as the role of women in our society. Still so much work to do, but we've made great strides. And so this conversation, to your point about 2022, builds on that work and asks the question, well, what do we want for our men and boys? We touched on my background and the reality that, many men and boys are struggling. And what we've found in our research is that a significant share, majority in fact, of men that we asked do perceive social pressures around what society expects from them. And so 2/3 of men that we surveyed in our research said that since they were a boy, they've been told that an inverted commas real man behaves in a certain way. And so this isn't sort of abstract ideas in terms of the pressures that men are feeling. And I guess in terms of your question and the responses that we receive to our work, we start from the premise of asking men and boys what they think. This work is deeply personal. And so for your listeners, I'd encourage folks to reflect what are the environments, what are the influences that have shaped your attitudes about what it means to be a man. Also, for that matter, what it means to be a woman. For me, being a part of sports clubs, they can be incredibly nurturing environments. But at times, I know, and playing footy through my early 20s, I was exposed to environments that put down women, that put this idea of a sort of a jocular man on a pedestal. Even working in hospitality, sexist comments, this sort of idea of the alpha male around the pool table. To be honest with you, Justin, and I'll be frank, working in politics up in Parliament House, you couldn't show a hint of vulnerability. Now, I was also lucky to be brought up by a single mum who really encouraged me to be myself, and she pushed back on gender norms herself. And so these ideas, I guess, we ask people to reflect on their own views and do our best to sort of meet them where they're at in a sort of non-judgmental, non-shaming way.
So, Matt, I want to respond to a couple of things and go off script a little bit. I mean, we were joking around before I started the interview with you because I couldn't find the questions. I thought, what sort of an interview is this going to be if I don't even have the questions? But I want to let go of those questions for a moment and reflect on a little bit of what you've said and ask you a question. After the break, we're going to dive deeply into what happens when men and boys find themselves in the man box. But first, the reality is, and you and I both know this, even though there's so many people who say, come on, it's 2022, surely we've moved beyond it. We haven't. Like, we actually have not moved beyond it. And when you look at, as you said, what happens in Parliament, what happens in sport clubs, what happens in schools, what happens in the bathrooms, in public places, what happens in movies, what happens on social media, we haven't moved past these archaic but very real man box, what was the word you used? I want to say principles, but that's not the right word. These man box beliefs. We just haven't. So the question that I want to ask you, as somebody who has thought long, deep and hard about masculinity, is what is it? Like, I ran a webinar just recently and I asked people, how do you define what is masculinity? What's healthy masculinity? What does it mean to be a man? And people were quiet and the responses eventually became really, really smart. But it takes a lot of thinking to figure out what is it to be a good man today. How do you define it? Where do you go with this?
Yeah, gee, it's a great question. It is the question, Justin, because these ideas, they vary across time.
Right.
They vary across cultures.
Yep.
And so the last thing we want to do in this work is prescribe another man box. We don't want to be saying, like, here's the sort of ideal set of ideals that every man in, our not so humble view should prescribe to. And so where we go when we think about healthy masculinity is the idea of flexibility and the idea of context. Enabling men and boys with the awareness, the self-awareness and the skills to acknowledge the situations they find themselves in and be free to choose how they show up. And so I think Tim Winton, one of our ambassadors, he shares an analogy that really helps me understand this. And that is, our men and boys, they're born with all of the colours in their pencil box. And yet as they grow, too often, and this is a social conditioning, social construction, too often those pencils one by one are taken away. So that perhaps when they're an adult, they've got a black, they've got a grey, synonymous with perhaps happiness, sadness, and perhaps anger. And yet we know there's over 400 positive and negative emotions. Those men and boys who can not just identify their emotions, but describe their emotions, they can accommodate stresses that they experience in their lives. The research is really clear on this. And so when we all will experience hard times, we'll all experience distress. And we know that a really important moderating factor that determines how we respond is the ability to describe our emotions. And so those men and boys who can describe their emotions, they're much less likely to respond with anger in the presence of distress.
Yeah, they've got the full palette, the full pencil case, all of the colours are there.
And how wonderful. Like we just on that palette idea, we go to music festivals, we go to festivals. We're exposed to so many different types of bands, and how wonderful is that to experience the full range of what's possible in a life well lived. And so that's the central tenet, I think, of this idea of healthy masculinity. It's this idea that, you've got the skills and the awareness to respond to a whole range of different situations.
After the break, we find out how we help our boys and men if they find themselves in the man box.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
Our boys are struggling with friends, mental health, alcohol, drugs, pornography, emotions, and so much more. But science tells us that the most important thing for your son's well-being is his connection with you. The Bringing Up Boys Summit is about one thing: taking you into your son's world and helping you connect with him in the way he needs you to. Find out more on the Happy Families webshop and start connecting with your son today. It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time poor parent who just wants answers now. Speaking with Matt Tyler from Jesuit Social Services about the man box. We'll be going in depth with all of this in the upcoming Bringing Up Boys Summit. Matt, what happens when our boys and our men find themselves in this man box with this set of beliefs that ultimately impact the way that they're engaging with life and with other people?
Yeah, these man box attitudes, Justin, they really matter. Our research looked at the extent to which these attitudes are associated with a range of harmful life outcomes for men and boys themselves, as well as people in their lives. And what we found was that men who are in the man box and so subscribe to these traditional ideas about what it means to be a man, they're 20 times as likely to self-report sexually harassing a woman.
Wow.
They're 14 times as likely to use physical violence, to self-report the use of physical violence. And then they're not doing so well themselves either. Over twice as likely to experience suicidal thoughts in the last 2 weeks. And I guess we know this intuitively. We're better off when we can show up as ourselves, not constrained or put in a box. And we see this, our frontline staff who work with men in the justice system, men experience poor mental health. They tell us this, that, there are recurring themes, and it's not just the man box. There's issues around, trauma and a whole range of other things that impact our lives. But they tell us that too often the men they're working with, they have their mask on. They're showing up in a way that is not actually emblematic of the person they are underneath that mask. And that's for a whole range of reasons in the environments that we're exposed to. But these man box attitudes, they're having a really significant impact on men and boys' lives.
I remember when I was in high school, Matt, I had a wonderful friend. She was just such a great girl, and she started dating this boy. And I got to be honest, he was not a nice guy. He was brutal to people in the playground. He was unkind towards kind of everyone because he was living into the man box. He had to have those man box attitudes on full display so that he could demonstrate his masculinity. And I remember saying to her as a friend, I said, "What are you doing with this guy? He's just so unkind." And she said something really interesting. She said, "Nobody else sees him the way I see him." He actually, she didn't use the words, but reflecting on what you've just said, she was essentially saying he takes off his mask when he's with me and I get to see him for who he is. And I thought, isn't that curious? Makes me think, do we have a masculinity crisis?
Just the example you shared before we get to crisis, wouldn't it be great if that young man could feel safe enough and have the permission to take off his mask absent when he's one-on-one with his girlfriend? That's a world that I'd want to be in, where that young man could show up and not engage in the harmful ways that you described. He was engaging in the playground. In terms of crisis, I'm a glass half full sort of person, Justin. And I'd say we don't have a crisis, but gee, we've got a massive opportunity. If we zoom right out, and think about the journey we've been on in the Western world over the last 200 years, we've seen 3 incredible waves of feminism. First, political and economic participation. Second, issues concerned around sexuality, family reproductive rights, women in the workplace. And then today we're seeing a game-changing conversation about violence, about pornography, about the commodification of women and girls in media and advertising. And there's still so much work to do, but gee, we've got a great opportunity to have a conversation about what we want for our men and boys. We're seeing, even touched on prisons, even in our schools, 80% of all expulsions in schools are boys. And so the work we do at the Men's Project, I guess, is centred on this idea of, we don't want our men and boys stuck in the man box. We want a world where they can be free to show up as themselves. It'll improve their well-being and also the well-being of people in their lives.
Matt, we will link to the Manbox and associated projects information in the show notes. Really excited to be able to explore with you all of these ideas at a whole lot more depth in the Bringing Up Boys Summit that's happening this Wednesday. If you haven't got your tickets, we have got such an incredible lineup of people. Peggy Orenstein, New York Times bestselling author of Boys and Sex. Professor Mark Brackett from Yale University. He's the director of the Center for Emotional Intelligence at Yale. Mia Friedman is going to be talking about how to raise the best boy in the room. Look, I could just keep on going. There's 10 extraordinary guests, and Matt Tyler is one of them. Matt, what a great discussion. Can't wait to learn more from you.
Thanks so much, Justin.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. For more information, visit happyfamilies.com.au, and hopefully we'll see you on the Bringing Up Boys Summit. All the details at Facebook or the website.